A millionaire was eagerly awaiting his daughter's return after she spent a month-long holiday abroad with his beautiful second wife. But the young girl only trudged silently up the stairs. 2 days later, the concerned father had to call 911 when his daughter's abdomen was visibly distended. The shocking truth, however, revealed a far more chilling reality. The Wilson Manor sat nestled amidst the ancient pine ridges of Connecticut, a place where mist often clung to the canopy, even when the sun was high. The colossal, elegant house possessed a chilling solitude, much like its owner at this very moment. Arthur Wilson paced the sprawling living room, the sound of his leather dress shoes clicking sharply and forlornly on the hardwood floor. He reached up to loosen the knot of his silk tie, even though it was already perfectly positioned. His eyes were glued to the grandfather clock on the wall. 30 days. For 30 days, the sound of a child's laughter had been absent from this house. The unease churning inside Arthur didn't stem from the multi-million-dollar architectural blueprints awaiting his signature, but from his profound yearning to see Daisy, his only precious daughter. The rumble of an approaching car engine tore through the twilight silence. Arthur abandoned the glass of red wine on the table and rushed toward the main entrance. A sleek black automobile pulled smoothly to a stop before the portico. The passenger door opened first. Elena stepped out radiant and dazzling. Her designer dress hugged her slender figure, emphasizing the sophisticated demeanor of the woman who held control within this family. She offered a smile precise to the millimeter, yet her eyes casually bypassed Arthur, darting instead to the rearview mirror for a quick check of her lipstick. "Well, we're home," Elena remarked carelessly, then turned to signal to the back seat. The car door opened slowly and heavily. Arthur held his breath, anticipating a sun-kissed tan, the salty scent of the ocean, and his daughter's joyous cry. But what emerged from the vehicle was a shadow. Daisy appeared small and swallowed up by a long-sleeved, zipped-up jacket, her hood pulled low, concealing half of her face. There was no seaside glow, no bright smile. Her skin was startlingly pale, lifelessly white like a sheet of wax paper pulled from a chilly drawer. "Daisy, it's Dad, sweetie." Arthur froze for a second, then his fatherly instincts surged. He hurried toward her, arms wide open, ready to sweep her into a hug. Daisy winced. Her frail shoulders beneath the heavy jacket trembled uncontrollably. She instinctively took a step back, shrinking away from her father's embrace in fear, then unconsciously pressed herself tightly against Elena's back. The action was heartbreakingly contradictory. She was seeking refuge precisely where her fear seemed to originate. Arthur halted, his arms still suspended midair. "What is the matter, sweetie? Why are you—" Elena stepped forward, forming a barrier between father and daughter. Her meticulously manicured hand rested on Daisy's shoulder, her fingers subtly applying pressure through the fabric of the coat. "Lower your voice, Arthur. You're upsetting her." "But look at her, Elena. She looks like she's just recovered from a serious illness." Elena sighed, her voice smooth and unwavering. "I told you, Arthur, Daisy has always been delicate. She had terrible car sickness the whole way home, plus she was reacting to the pollen at the resort. She's been experiencing episodes of distress all day and hasn't been able to keep anything down." Arthur looked into his daughter's deeply shadowed eyes. Daisy kept her head bowed, completely avoiding his gaze. He wanted to ask if she was experiencing any discomfort, but the sheer exhaustion etched on her face made him hesitate. His blind faith in his beautiful wife once again overshadowed his paternal intuition. "All right, forgive me. Go on upstairs and rest." Elena nodded with satisfaction. She turned to Daisy, her voice sweet yet cold. "Did you hear your father, Daisy? Go to your room and take a nap. Don't bother your father anymore." Daisy didn't utter a word. She turned her back, dragging her feet heavily toward the staircase. Her gait was unsteady and exhausted, like an elderly person, not a 9-year-old child returning from a vacation. Arthur stood rooted in the foyer, his eyes following the small figure as it vanished up the dark wooden stairs. As Daisy reached the landing, his gaze unintentionally fell upon her feet. Her red leather shoes. Daisy's favorite pair, which she insisted on bringing to the beach to wear with her pretty dresses. The souls were shiny and black under the crystal chandelier light. They were absolutely spotless. Not a scuff, not a speck of dust, and definitely not a single grain of sand lodged in the grooves of the tread. Elena's enthusiastic reports from last week flashed through Arthur's mind. "We walk along the beach for an hour every morning, darling. Daisy loves playing in the sand." How could a child who supposedly walked on the sand every day for a whole month have shoe soles as pristine as if they had just been taken out of the box? "Arthur, come and eat. I'm famished." Elena's call pulled Arthur out of the confusing mental reel about the spotless red shoes. He flinched, blinking a few times to shake off the chill that had just traced down his spine. Maybe she had put on a new pair of shoes just before leaving, Arthur reasoned, settling for the most plausible explanation, even though he knew deep down how flimsy it was. He pushed the suspicion aside, letting Elena take his arm and lead him into the dining room, where candlelight flickered across the long mahogany table. The dinner was elaborately set with candles and fresh flowers, but the yellow light did little to warm the atmosphere. On the contrary, the long shadows cast on the walls emphasized the distance between the three people seated at the table. Elena sat at the head of the table, sipping her red wine. She launched into a conversation with enthusiastic excitement, her hands gesturing with every word. "You wouldn't believe how exquisite the spa service was. I spoke to the manager. They're sending me samples of their newest skincare line. You absolutely must come with me next time." Arthur nodded, attempting to smile and engage with his wife's stories, but his eyes continually flicked to the opposite side of the table. Daisy sat there small and lost in the oversized high-backed chair. She kept her head down, her hands resting in her lap, completely detached from Elena's animated chatter. In front of her was a plate of perfectly cooked prime steak, the rich sauce emanating a tempting aroma. Arthur noticed his daughter's shoulders subtly trembling. Daisy slowly reached for her fork. Her frail hand was shaking so badly that the fork clinked faintly against the porcelain plate. Her eyes were fixed intensely on the meat, her throat making continuous swallowing movements. It wasn't the look of a picky eater, but the raw, screaming glance of primal hunger. Unable to watch his daughter struggle with the cutlery, Arthur leaned forward, tenderly cutting the meat on her plate into small pieces. "Go on and eat, sweetie. It's the chef's specialty." Daisy looked up at her father for a fleeting second, a weak glimmer of hope in her eyes. She picked up the fork, speared a tiny piece of meat, and brought it toward her mouth. Her nostrils flared slightly, inhaling the scent of the food. But just as the meat was about to touch her lips, Daisy abruptly stopped. Instinctively, she glanced toward the head of the table. Elena still held her wineglass poised and graceful. She didn't say anything, nor did her smile falter, but her icy gaze slid over the rim of the glass and pierced straight toward Daisy. A look filled with warning and clear intimidation. Clink. The fork dropped onto the plate. Daisy pulled her hand back as if she had touched a hot ember. She shoved the plate away, lowering her head even further to conceal her fear. I'm not hungry. May I please be excused to my room?" Her voice was tiny, crumbling in the silent space. Arthur was stunned. He put down his knife and fork, looking from his daughter to the untouched plate of food. "Why aren't you hungry? I clearly saw you wanted to eat, Daisy. What's going on with you?" Elena placed her wine glass down and let out a long, dramatic sigh. She rubbed her temples, her expression shifting to the weary, resigned look of a frustrated, helpless mother. "See, I told you, but you wouldn't listen. She's been like this all week. She's refusing to eat as a way to oppose me." Oppose you? What else would you call it? Just because I didn't buy her that new tablet, she's been acting out this entire trip. She knows you'll feel sorry for her, so she deliberately starves herself to make me look like the wicked stepmother in your eyes. I'm so exhausted, Arthur." Arthur looked at his wife's pained expression, then at his daughter's stubborn silence. The fatigue after a long workday, combined with Elena's seemingly reasonable accusations, made him waver. He chose the path of least resistance, trusting the adult. Arthur frowned, his voice dropping into a tone of strict seriousness. "Daisy, I don't appreciate misbehavior. Don't upset your mother anymore. If you don't want to eat, then go to your room." Daisy offered no explanation, nor did she cry. She slid off the chair and shuffled out of the dining room like a wandering shadow. The darkness in the hallway quickly swallowed her small figure. The dinner ended in awkward constraint. Arthur chewed the steak in his mouth, finding it bland and tasteless like straw. That night the mansion was shrouded in silent darkness. Arthur tossed and turned in bed. The image of Daisy's trembling hands kept haunting him, preventing him from sleeping. His throat felt dry, and he decided to go down to the kitchen for a drink of water. The hallway was deserted, with only the sound of Arthur's bare footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. As he passed the kitchen door, he suddenly heard an unusual sound. Scratch. Scratch. The sound was very faint, coming from the corner of the room where the large trash receptacle was located. It sounded like a mouse or someone rummaging for something. Arthur frowned, creeping closer. He held his breath, placing his hand on the light switch. Click. The fluorescent light suddenly flooded the room, revealing a sight that made Arthur's heart seize up. Daisy was sitting on the cold kitchen floor, right next to the open trash receptacle. In her hands were brittle pieces of stale breadcrumbs, the burnt crusts that the chef had trimmed off earlier that afternoon. She was hurriedly stuffing the filthy, discarded scraps into her mouth, chewing frantically, urgently, and with the panic of a small, starved animal. Her cheeks were puffed out and crumbs were scattered across her loose nightgown. When the light snapped on, Daisy jumped spinning around. Her eyes widened in horror as she looked at her father, her mouth still full of crumbs. She hadn't had time to swallow, her hands frozen midair. Arthur stood motionless in the chilly kitchen, his mouth agape, unable to utter a sound. Before him, a panicked Daisy quickly spit the breadcrumbs onto the floor. Her hands scraped against the ground as she scrambled to get up. Her eyes reflected ultimate terror, as if she'd been caught committing a terrible felony. "Daisy, wait." Brr. Arthur reached out to stop her, but Daisy, like a frightened squirrel, darted past him, vanishing into the darkness of the hallway. Arthur stood frozen, staring at the breadcrumbs scattered on the polished floor. A glacial feeling crept into his core. This was not the behavior of a picky child, or one throwing a tantrum. The next morning, the weak Connecticut sunshine filtered through the old pine trees, casting faint light onto the living room windows. The clock struck 9, but the house remained eerily silent. Daisy had not come downstairs. Arthur sat at the dining table, his coffee long gone cold. He couldn't bring himself to swallow anything after the sight of the previous night. A fierce determination to find the truth compelled him to stand up. He had to go to her room. He had to find out why his little girl was so desperately hungry. Arthur ascended the staircase, each step heavy with worry. Just as his hand touched the doorknob to his daughter's room, a terrifying sound erupted from within, clutching his heart. A violent, agonizing sound of retching, as if tearing her insides apart. Arthur didn't hesitate for another second. He forcefully twisted the doorknob and burst into the room. The sharp, sour smell of stomach acid immediately assaulted his senses, making him dizzy. Daisy was curled up on the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the headboard until her knuckles were white. Her small body convulsed with every stomach spasm. On the pristine white bedspread, yellowish digestive fluids were splattered. There was no trace of food, only the bitter bile expelled from a completely empty stomach. "Oh Lord, Daisy." Arthur rushed over, kneeling beside her. He held Daisy's limp body, feeling the cold, sweat-soaked nightgown clinging to her back. She went faint in his arms, her breath catching her face, bloodlessly pale. Her body temperature was abnormally cold, a stark contrast to the sweat pouring off her. "It hurts. My tummy hurts. Dad." The weak whimper escaping Daisy's dry lips pierced Arthur like a needle. He frantically reached for a towel to wipe her face, his trembling hand pulling his phone from his pocket. "I'm calling the doctor right now. Hold on, sweetie, the doctor will be here soon." Just as Arthur's finger was about to tap the screen, a figure appeared in the doorway. Elena stood there, holding a steaming cup of coffee, her flowing silk morning gown hugging her perfect figure. She looked into the room, her eyes quickly scanning Arthur's panic, then settling on the mess on the bed. Instead of concern, her beautiful face hardened her eyebrows, furrowing with annoyance and disgust. "What in the world is this?" Arthur looked up, his eyes pleading toward his wife. "Elena, call emergency services. She looks terrible. I think it's food poisoning or something much more serious." Elena didn't move. She calmly walked into the room, placing her coffee cup carefully on the vanity table, ensuring not a drop spilled. Then she approached Arthur, snatching the phone from his grasp with lightning speed. "Are you insane? Calm down, Arthur." "How can I calm down? Look at her, she's retching up bile." Elena glanced at the stained bedspread, her voice sharply grating with indignation over the damage. "Of course she's in distress. Do you know how much this Italian bed set cost? I ordered it just last week. And now look, she's ruined it." "What are you talking about? Our daughter's in agony and you're worried about bed linens." Arthur bellowed, his fury starting to boil over. But Elena was unfazed. She was a master manipulator. She lowered her voice, shifting from shrill anger to a calm, knowledgeable, and gently scolding tone, as if speaking to a child who didn't understand the situation. "Listen to me, Arthur. I know you worry about her, and I do too. But you have to look at this realistically. What did you see her doing in the kitchen last night? She was rummaging through the trash, wasn't she?" Arthur was silenced. The image from last night resurfaced. Elena smirked faintly, as if she had already figured everything out. "See, I knew it. I saw her sneaking downstairs. She ate spoiled things from the trash, which is why she's having this severe digestive upset this morning. Children eat things they shouldn't and feel poorly. It happens all the time. Haven't you been a father long enough to know that? But this doesn't look like regular indigestion. She's freezing cold all over." Elena cut him off, her voice turning firm and threatening. "So what are you planning to do now? Call an ambulance with sirens blaring. Then the neighbors will flock over, the reporters will sniff out a scandal. Tomorrow's front page will scream, 'Millionaire Arthur Wilson's daughter, hospitalized in critical condition, possible neglect.' Do you want your company's stock to plummet? Do you want people pointing fingers at me, calling me the wicked stepmother?" Every word Elena spoke hammered nails into Arthur's mind. She struck his greatest fear, his reputation and career. The internal conflict tore at the father fiercely. On one side was his precious little girl fading in his arms. On the other, the dark scenario Elena painted, threatening to destroy everything he had painstakingly built. Arthur looked down at Daisy. She was small in his lap, her breathing weak and intermittent. Her small hands were still clutching her stomach, eyes tightly shut in resignation. No cries, no struggle. Her silence made Arthur feel helpless. He wondered, was he overreacting? Was Elena right? She was a woman. Perhaps she understood children's ailments better than he did a man who spent his life focused on blueprints and construction. Sensing Arthur's hesitation, Elena delivered the final blow. She sat down next to him, placing a hand on his shoulder, her voice becoming soft and reassuring. "Trust me, Arthur. I already have high-dose pain relievers ready for her. Just give them to her, let her rest a bit, and she'll be fine. Don't blow things out of proportion. We can handle this ourselves." Exhaustion and a vague fear defeated Arthur's will to resist. He let out a long sigh, giving in. He nodded weakly, deceiving himself that this was the best choice for everyone. "All right, I'll trust you. But if she's not better by the afternoon, I am definitely calling a doctor." "Of course, darling. Now put her down so I can clean up this mess. Looking at this bedspread makes me ill." Arthur gently laid Daisy back down on the pillow. He looked at her pale face one last time, a mix of sorrow and guilt swelling in his heart. He stood up, stripped off the soiled bedspread, and rolled it into a ball, tossing it into the corner as Elena directed. "I'm going to work for a bit, Daisy. Be a good girl, take your medication, and a good sleep will make you better," Arthur whispered, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. Daisy didn't reply, just a small, almost imperceptible nod. Arthur heavily walked out of the room, leaving his small daughter sinking into a semi-conscious state behind him. Elena shut the door, the latch clicking concisely shut, confining the suffocating atmosphere inside. The closed door obscured the light from the hallway, leaving Daisy isolated in the dark light shadows of the large room. Beneath the thin blanket, Daisy's hands clutched her abdomen where the discomfort was not subsiding, but intensifying into violent twisting spasms. A dreadful turn of events far beyond the selfish control and calculation of the adults was silently brewing and about to erupt, threatening to sweep away the false tranquility of this grand estate. Arthur slammed his study door shut, but the silence of the library couldn't drown out Daisy's faint whimpering, which echoed constantly in his mind. He paced back and forth, his eyes fixed on the computer screen, yet unable to read a single email. The suffocating atmosphere in the house made it hard to breathe. He needed air. He needed to escape the guilt gnawing at his conscience. Arthur pushed the door open and stepped out into the back garden. The cool evening wind of the suburbs whipped his face, carrying the damp scent of decaying leaves. The sky was turning a gloomy gray, signaling an approaching rainstorm. Arthur shivered, pulling a cigarette pack from his vest pocket and lighting the third one of the day. The thick white smoke dissipated into the air, but the anxiety in his heart grew denser. He walked among the thorny rose bushes, his mind severely conflicted. On one side was his trust in the beautiful, capable wife he was so proud of. On the other, his fatherly gut feeling that something was terribly wrong with his daughter. In the corner of the garden near the old long-sealed shed, a figure was hunched over working. It was Mr. Thomas, the aging gardener who had been with the Wilson estate since Arthur was a child. Mr. Thomas was sweeping dried leaves, his movements slow and labored. Hearing the footsteps, he looked up. When he saw Arthur, a flicker of confusion crossed his cloudy eyes. He lowered his gaze, pretending to focus on his work, but the hands holding the broom were visibly shaking. Arthur noticed the unusual nervousness in the normally placid and quiet gardener. He walked closer, extinguishing a cigarette under his heel. "Hello, Thomas. The weather's changing. Is your bad knee bothering you?" Mr. Thomas flinched, the broom nearly dropping to the ground. He looked up at Arthur, his eyes hesitant, pausing as if he wanted to say something important, then stopping as if an invisible hand were clamping his mouth shut. "Thank you, sir. I'm fine. It's just, it looks like rain, sir. You should go back inside." His voice was hoarse, his eyes darting toward a small ventilation window high up on the wall of the shed behind Arthur's back. A look of haunting fear. Arthur narrowed his eyes, following the old man's gaze. The shed contained old broken furniture and an abandoned wine cellar. Elena had insisted on locking it 3 years ago because she hated the musty smell emanating from it. "Is there something about the shed, Thomas, you keep looking at it?" Mr. Thomas took a deep breath, his thin chest heaving beneath his loose coat. He looked around nervously as if afraid of being overheard, then his wrinkled, calloused hand tremblingly reached into his deep pocket. "Sir, I wasn't going to say anything. I fear, madam, but seeing little Daisy this morning, I couldn't hold back." He pulled out a small object tightly wrapped in a dirty, soil-stained handkerchief. His hand shook as he held it out to Arthur like a significant piece of evidence. "Yesterday morning when I was trimming the climbing vines on the shed wall, I found this stuck in the crack of the high ventilation window." Arthur took the cloth bundle. He slowly unwrapped the handkerchief. His heart dropped. Cradled in his palm was a tiny cloth doll, Daisy's closest companion. She called it Mimi, an inseparable item Daisy always held while sleeping, even on long trips. But this Mimi was not clean and fragrant as usual. It was miserably shredded. One plastic eye was missing. The cloth body was smeared with thick, greasy black machine oil. And strangest of all, covering the black oil, was a thick, chalky white layer of dust clinging tightly to every fiber of the fabric. Arthur was stunned, his thumb gently brushing the white dust. It was fine like powder, yet gritty like wall plaster. How is it here? Daisy was supposed to have taken it to the beach with Elena for the entire month. Arthur mumbled the question, leaving his lips without conscious thought. Mr. Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper, his old eyes serious like never before. That's exactly what troubled me, sir. I saw Madame Elena carrying the suitcase to the car that day, but I never saw the little mistress take this doll out the gate. And there's this too." He paused, swallowing hard, then decided to release the truth weighing on his heart. "For the past month, I've been working around this garden every day. I swear to God, I never saw anyone open the door to that shed. The rusty padlock was intact, but occasionally during the quiet midday hours, I would hear strange sounds coming from inside." What kind of sound? Arthur pressed his voice, starting to sound strained. A scratching sound, like a mouse clawing at the wall. Very faint but persistent. I kept thinking it was rats nesting, but now seeing this doll stuck in the window, I'm afraid it wasn't rats, sir. A jolt of electricity shot down Arthur's spine, leaving him numb. The sound of scratching, a doll stained with plaster, spotless shoes free of sand, and Daisy's desperate wild hunger last night, all the fragmented pieces suddenly connected, forming a terrifying picture. A huge question exploded in Arthur's mind, shattering all the rationale and trust he had desperately clung to. If Daisy had genuinely been on a beach vacation with Elena for the entire month, why was her inseparable doll stuck in the ventilation window of a locked shed, and the sound Mr. Thomas heard, that desperate scratching? Arthur spun around, staring at the magnificent manor standing tall on the hill. Warm yellow light spilled from the second-floor bedroom window where Elena was supposedly with Daisy. That seemingly peaceful scene now appeared distorted and utterly menacing in Arthur's eyes. The vague suspicion from before had now transformed into a tangible dread. He no longer doubted Elena was lying. He was terrified for his daughter's safety right inside the house he had believed to be the safest sanctuary. Mr. Thomas hastily stepped back, picked up his broom, and resumed his work, looking nervous, as if fearing discovery after talking to his boss. He left Arthur standing frozen in the garden, his hand clutching the dirty doll, his knuckles white, trembling uncontrollably. A frigid gust of wind swept through swirling dry leaves around Arthur's feet, but the cold outside was nothing compared to the icy dread spreading in his chest. Arthur gritted his teeth, stuffing the doll into his inner jacket pocket. He had to resolve this, right now. He would drag Elena out and force her to explain all these glaring inconsistencies. He wouldn't listen to her manipulative sweet talk for another second. Arthur turned, striding rapidly toward the back door. Every step hit the damp ground with force, charged with his long-suppressed anger. He had just set foot on the stone steps, hand reaching for the doorknob to enter the house, when a sound tore through the quiet evening air. A piercing, agonizing scream echoed from the second-floor bedroom window, the cry of a child enduring horrific physical anguish. It was Daisy. If you were standing before a locked door, hearing your child's tormented screams inside, would you calmly search for the key or break it down at any cost? The agonizing scream still ringing in his ears, Arthur charged into the house like a madman, his fists slamming against the heavy oak door. The powerful impacts echoed violently in the chilling silence of the house. "Open the door, Elena. Open this door right now." The screams inside did not stop, interspersed with crashing noises. Daisy's cries grew weaker, sounding like the desperate whimpers of a small trapped creature. The only reply to Arthur's frantic attempts was Elena's voice shouting with anger and panic. "Be quiet. She's throwing a fit. Don't come in here and interfere with how I handle my child." "Throwing a fit? Are you deaf? She is in terrible pain and you call it a fit." Arthur roared, his last remnants of patience completely burned away. He didn't wait another second. He stepped back to gain momentum, then with all his might lunged his heavy body against the door. Crash. The oak door shuddered violently but didn't give way. Arthur gritted his teeth, his anger erupting like volcanic magma. He slammed his shoulder into it a second time, then a third. Crack. The sharp sound of wood splintering resonated. The lock burst open, and fragments of wood scattered across the floor. The door swung wide, and Arthur stumbled into the room, his breathing ragged, his chest heaving fiercely. But the moment he regained his balance, the sight before him paralyzed Arthur. The spacious bedroom was a war zone. Expensive perfume bottles lay shattered on the wooden floor, the pungent scent suffocating. Daisy was writhing in the middle of the chaos, her hands clawing desperately at the bedspread, tearing it into shreds. In her painful struggle, Daisy's loose nightgown had ridden up to her chest, and there, right beneath her protruding frail ribs, was a massive protrusion. Daisy's abdominal area was grotesquely swollen, perfectly round, and taut as a drumhead. Arthur's mouth dropped open, his knees buckled. The image of that distended abdomen. It was so illogical, so cruel. It looked exactly like the belly of a woman, 6 or 7 months into a pregnancy, heavy and crushing her small 9-year-old body. What is this? Arthur stammered, his voice fracturing. He couldn't believe his eyes. How could this happen? She was just experiencing digestive distress this morning, wasn't she? Why was her abdomen so large? A dark, terrifying thought flashed through his mind. Abuse. Pregnancy. The horrifying words danced wildly, strangling the father's heart. Arthur, let me explain. A trembling voice came from the corner of the room. Elena was huddled near the wardrobe. She was staring at Daisy's abdomen with sheer horror, yet desperately trying to maintain her last shred of false composure. It's probably just because she ate too much. I told you she was scavenging and eating all sorts of rubbish from the trash last night. She's bloated. Children often get this. Arthur slowly turned his head, looking at his wife, clinging to clumsy lies. His eyes no longer held love or trust. Only a dark chasm of revulsion and hatred remained. He didn't say a word to Elena. He didn't even spare her another glance. He rushed to the bedside where Daisy was beginning to seize up in spasms. "Daddy's here. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, sweetie." Arthur was weeping as he quickly grabbed a thin blanket, wrapping his daughter's body, tightly concealing that terrifyingly distorted abdomen. He slid his hands under her back, feeling the intense heat radiating from her delicate skin, yet her hands and feet were icy cold. Arthur swept Daisy up into his arms. The lightness of her body made his anguish even deeper. She was too light as a dying leaf, with only that rigid, swollen abdomen heavy as stone. He turned and hurried toward the door, but Elena lunged forward, blocking his path. "What are you doing? Where are you taking her?" Elena spread her arms wide, obstructing the exit, her face contorted with panic. She wasn't worried about Daisy. She was afraid for herself. "Get out of my way!" Arthur roared. "No, you can't take her to the hospital now. Do you know what time it is? If people see her in this condition, what will they think of me? They will call me a wicked stepmother. Do you want to ruin our family's reputation?" Elena struggled to pull the blanket away from Daisy, her sharp fingernails scraping Arthur's arm until it bled. "Give her to me. I have strong pain medication here. Just give it to her and she'll sleep. Don't turn a small issue into a disaster." Elena's selfishness, cruelty, and emotional vacancy were the last straw. The rage in Arthur exploded, more powerful than ever before. "Get lost!" Arthur swung his arm, forcefully shoving Elena with his elbow. The impact sent her staggering, tumbling to the floor, her head hitting the edge of the dresser with a dull thud. Elena clutched her head, looking up at her husband with stunned eyes. She had never seen Arthur like this. The man who had always been meek and doting was now looking at her like she was a monster. Never lay your filthy hands on my daughter again. If anything happens to her, I swear I will end you." Arthur hissed through clenched teeth, his voice filled with deadly menace. He stepped over Elena, not looking back at her as she began to wail and complain behind him. Arthur ran down the stairs with his daughter bolting out the front door. The pitch-black night swallowed the father and daughter. The night wind screamed as if trying to tear apart the silent space. He carefully placed Daisy in the back seat, securing her seatbelt, his trembling hand fumbling the key into the ignition. "Hold on, sweetie, I'm taking you to the doctor now. Don't go to sleep. Daisy, don't you dare go to sleep." Arthur floored the gas pedal. The car roared away, leaving the magnificent manor behind, now resembling a tomb burying terrifying secrets. The car sped away, tearing through the deserted road leading to the city center. Streetlights flashed past the window, creating streaks of light. Arthur glanced into the rearview mirror, his heart constricting repeatedly. In the back seat, Daisy had stopped whimpering. Her body had gone limp, sliding down the seat. Her head was tilted to one side, eyes closed, her frail chest rising so faintly that Arthur had to hold his breath to confirm she was still alive. Silence enveloped the cramped space in the car, heavier and more frightening than any scream. Arthur clenched his jaw, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the bitter taste on his lips. He pressed the gas harder, racing into the dark night, competing with death to reclaim the life of the small daughter he had almost lost because of his own negligence. Screech! The high-pitched sound of tires burning rubber tore through the quiet night outside the emergency room of Central Hospital. Acrid smoke billowed from the tires as Arthur's black sedan slammed to an urgent stop right in front of the automatic glass doors. Before the car fully stopped, Arthur flung his door open and rushed out. He didn't care about the parking regulations, nor about his rumpled, expensive suit. He opened the back door, scooped up the unconscious Daisy in his arms, and stormed into the hospital lobby like a frantic man. "Emergency, is anyone here? Save my daughter, please." Arthur's hoarse, desperate shout echoed through the sterile white hallway, causing everyone present to turn and stare. Two on-duty nurses immediately rushed over with a gurney. A young doctor scribbling notes quickly dropped his pen and followed them. "Put the patient here. Hurry." Arthur gently placed Daisy onto the white pad of the gurney. The instant the thin blanket fell away, revealing her grotesquely swollen abdomen, the entire emergency team froze for a second. The young nurse covered her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. The young doctor frowned, his gaze rapidly sweeping over the child's thin, pale body, then settling on the taut, vein-covered abdomen. A flicker of suspicion and outrage crossed his eyes, but his professionalism quickly took over. "Prepare Intensive Care Unit 1. Call the Chief of Surgery immediately. Pediatric patient suspected acute intestinal blockage or severe internal trauma." The doctor barked the order, simultaneously pressing a stethoscope to Daisy's chest and checking her wrist pulse. "Pulse is weak, blood pressure is dropping. Prepare the defibrillator." The gurney was pushed away at breakneck speed, the wheels screeching on the tiled floor. Arthur ran alongside, gripping his daughter's icy cold hand, muttering meaningless prayers. "Daddy's here, Daisy. Daddy's right here." But as they reached the emergency room doors, the nurse turned back and firmly blocked him. "Excuse me, sir, you cannot enter here. Please stay outside and complete the paperwork. We will do our absolute best." "Save her, please!" Arthur clutched the nurse's arm, his voice broken. "We understand. Please calm down." The emergency room door slammed shut in Arthur's face. The red light above the frame illuminated brightly the words, "Operating in progress." Glaring red, staring at him like the eye of a demon, separating him from the daughter fighting for every breath inside. All the strength drained out of Arthur. He stumbled back a few steps, then collapsed onto the cold, waiting bench in the hallway. His trembling hands gripped his head, his fingers running through his hair, which looked visibly grayer after one long, grueling night. The image of Daisy's bizarrely swollen abdomen continued to torment his mind, refusing to dissipate. It danced before his eyes, dragging with it the darkest and most terrible speculations. Why was her stomach like that? What had Elena done to her? Or did someone else, during the supposed beach trip? The thought that his daughter might have been sexually assaulted made Arthur's stomach churn. He wanted to throw up, to scream, to break everything around him, to relieve the agonizing pain and hatred consuming his soul. He cursed himself. He was a terrible father. He had wealth, power, and built skyscrapers reaching the clouds, yet he couldn't protect his tiny daughter right inside his own house. Time dragged on heavy as lead. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the dry, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Each sound hammered at Arthur's already strained nerves. 1 hour then, 2 hours passed. Ding. The elevator chime shattered the stillness. The metal doors slid open. 2 men in police uniforms stepped out. One was middle-aged with a grim, experienced look. The other was younger, holding a notepad, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. They walked straight to the nurse's station, whispering something, then both looked toward the emergency room where Arthur sat, slumped over. Arthur's heart tightened. Police. Why were they here? He hadn't called the police. The older officer nodded in thanks to the nurse, then strode toward Arthur. The sound of his uniform shoes on the floor was cold and commanding. "Mr. Arthur Wilson." Arthur looked up. His bloodshot, deeply shadowed eyes met the two officers. He slowly rose, nodding confirmation. "I'm Sergeant Miller, Criminal Investigation Division. This is Detective Davis." The officer introduced himself. His gaze toward Arthur held no sympathy but was filled with suspicion and scrutiny. "We received an emergency notification from the hospital regarding the unusual admission of a minor. Patient Daisy Wilson, age 9, admitted in critical condition with signs of severe internal damage, suspected to be the result of abuse or assault." Arthur swayed as if he might fall. The officer's words were like a death sentence confirming his worst fears. So the doctor suspected it too. The doctor called the police because he thought Arthur, the father who brought her in, was either the perpetrator or an accomplice. "No, it wasn't me. I'm her father." Arthur stammered, his voice trembling and failing. "I didn't do anything. I just wanted to save my daughter." "We haven't reached any conclusions, Mr. Wilson." Sergeant Miller cut in, his tone firm yet measured. "But according to protocol, we need you to answer some questions while we wait for the doctor's results. Can you tell us what happened to your daughter tonight?" Arthur swallowed the bitter lump in his throat. The guilt surged, strangling him. He started to recount the story, his voice broken, about the beach trip, the strange return Elena, and the terrifyingly swollen abdomen. Every word he spoke felt like rubbing salt into his bleeding wounds. Just then, the red light above the emergency room door went dark. The door swung open. The chief of surgery stepped out. He was still wearing his blue scrubs, his mask pulled down to his chin, revealing a sweat-soaked, visibly exhausted face. Above all, his expression was extremely tense and grave. The doctor's eyes searched for the family member. When he saw Arthur standing next to the two police officers, he showed no surprise. Instead, he gave a decisive nod as if he had anticipated this situation. He walked past Arthur without stopping to announce the news in the hallway. He gestured with a tilt of his head toward an office at the end of the hall. "Mr. Wilson and both officers, please come to my office. There are things you need to see for yourselves." Arthur felt his legs turn to lead. He slowly trudged behind the doctor, his heart pounding in his chest. A dark premonition encompassed him. In the private office, the cold scent of medical disinfectant and old paperwork filled the air. The chief of surgery walked straight to the X-ray light box hanging on the wall. He reached out and flipped the switch. Click. The blinding white light illuminated the black and white X-ray film of Daisy's abdomen. Arthur held his breath. He stared intently at the film, awaiting the verdict on his daughter's fate. Beside him, Sergeant Miller squinted, his right hand unconsciously resting lightly on the holster of his sidearm, a guarded and threatening gesture, ready for an immediate arrest if the dark truth were revealed. Between the honor of a wealthy family and the life of a child, how fragile is that line? How many fathers would discard their pride to save their child like Arthur? The blinding white light shone onto the X-ray film, illuminating the deepest dark secrets hidden inside Daisy's frail body. Arthur squinted against the glare, but then his pupils dilated fully as he saw the image on the black and white background. A dense, lumpy, and distorted black mass entirely filled his daughter's lower abdomen. It had no shape of a fetus, no limbs or heartbeat. It looked like a rough, jagged boulder crushing the surrounding internal organs. "Doctor, tell me, how far along is the pregnancy?" "Who did this?" Arthur demanded, his voice cracking, his hand gripping the edge of the desk until his knuckles were white. Sergeant Miller beside him was equally tense, his hand still hovering over his sidearm, prepared to document a most vile crime. The chief of surgery turned and looked straight into Arthur's eyes. He shook his head decisively, his gaze filled with both sympathy and indignation. "There is no pregnancy, Mr. Wilson. Your daughter was not sexually assaulted." Arthur felt a 1,000-pound weight lift from his chest. He exhaled a long sigh, but before he could rejoice, the doctor's next sentence plunged him into another abyss. "But her condition is even more dangerous. Daisy has severe acute mechanical intestinal obstruction. The black mass you see here is a colossal undigested foreign body blocking her bowel." "Foreign body? What do you mean? What did she swallow?" Arthur asked, bewildered. The doctor didn't answer immediately. He put on medical gloves, reaching for a clear Ziploc bag labeled "Endoscopy Sample, Patient Daisy Wilson," from a tray of instruments. He placed it on the desk under the bright light. Inside the bag was a clump of spongy white fragments speckled with tiny pieces of shredded paper, which had turned a grayish color from digestive fluids. Arthur picked up the evidence bag, his hand shaking violently. He squinted at the white fragments. It wasn't food. Its texture, porous light with tiny air pockets. A lightning bolt struck Arthur's mind, illuminating the memory of the afternoon in the backyard, the old shed, the insulated walls. "This is insulation foam," Arthur whispered, his voice failing in horror. "And old wallpaper. This pattern only exists in the sealed storage room in my backyard." Sergeant Miller frowned, stepping closer to examine the evidence bag. Why would a child eat insulation foam and wallpaper? The chief of surgery sighed, taking off his glasses to wipe them. His voice deepened, carrying the weight of medical knowledge and the sorrow of a healer. "In medicine, we call this pica syndrome, the compulsive eating of non-food items. It is a severe psychological disorder often occurring in children when they suffer from prolonged severe nutritional deficiency or endure extreme anxiety and stress in an isolated environment." He looked at Arthur, his gaze sharp as a scalpel. "Your daughter was not struck with a whip, Mr. Wilson, but she was starved. Starved to the point where her survival instinct manifested in this distorted way. In her extreme hunger and fear from being confined alone, she had to scratch the walls, peeling off chunks of foam and paper to trick her empty stomach, which was racked by spasms." Arthur dropped the evidence bag onto the desk. The tiny thud echoed in his ears like thunder. She ate the walls. She ate the walls, waiting for her father to come home. The image of the skinny Daisy, her trembling hands picking up breadcrumbs from the trash, resurfaced vividly, and the Mimi doll covered in plaster that Mr. Thomas had given him. Everything was clear now. Daisy never went to the beach. She had been locked in that dark shed, gnawing on loneliness and cold walls to survive each day, while he, the indifferent father, sat in his warm study, believing Elena's sweet lies. Arthur buried his head in his arms on the desk, his shoulders shaking uncontrollably. Hot tears streamed down his face, falling onto the cold wooden surface. They were tears of too late remorse, of ultimate pain, upon realizing that his own neglect had helped the devil torture his daughter. He was an accomplice. He was the one who pushed his child into a living hell right inside his own home. "Bastard. I am a bastard." Sergeant Miller said nothing. He silently pulled out his radio and pressed the call button. His voice rang out sharply in the silent room. "Central, this is Miller. Request immediate lockdown of the scene at Wilson Manor, 42 Oakwood Drive. Send a forensics team right away, check the back shed, and issue a warrant to escort the suspect, Elena Wilson, to the hospital immediately. Charges: aggravated child mistreatment and endangerment, resulting in serious harm." A faint Roger that crackled from the other end. Outside the window, the distant wail of police sirens began tearing through the city's quiet night. The sound grew louder, signaling the arrival of justice and the punishment rapidly approaching the perpetrator. The office door burst open. 2 young police officers escorted Elena inside. She was still wearing her luxurious silk dress, her head held high in arrogance. Despite being held tightly by two large men, Elena maintained a haughty demeanor, her red-painted lips curling into a sneer of contempt. Her cold eyes swept across the room, stopping at Arthur, who was slumped over the desk, her gaze filled with challenge and disdain, utterly unaware that the evidence of her crime lay exposed right on the desk. "Let me go. Do you know who I am? I will sue this shabby hospital and your incompetent police department for unlawful detention." Elena struggled fiercely, shaking off the officer holding her shoulder. Her voice was sharp and acrid, echoing throughout the small room. She adjusted the creases of her dress, smoothed her tangled hair, attempting to regain the dignified air of an offended noblewoman. "Arthur, what are you doing sitting there? Tell them to release me immediately. They are falsely accusing me. They dare say I mistreated Daisy. That's ridiculous." Arthur slowly lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot and swollen from crying, but now they were dry, cold as stone. He said nothing. He picked up the Ziploc bag containing the foam fragments and shredded paper from the table, stood up and walked over to Elena. "Look." Arthur threw the evidence bag right at Elena's feet. Elena glanced down. When she recognized the contents, her pupils contracted in a moment of confusion. But just as quickly, she regained her terrifying composure, nudging the evidence bag aside with the point of her high heel. "What is this garbage? Why are you showing me trash? That is what my daughter ate to survive in the shed where you can find her for the past month, Elena." Arthur's voice was low, trembling with suppressed rage. "You're insane, Arthur. I told you she has mental issues. How is it my fault if she ate junk I took her to the beach? You saw the photos." She still denied everything, her face emotionless. Her brazenness solidified the air in the room. Sergeant Miller took a step forward, slamming a thick file down on the desk. The sharp thump cut through Elena's clumsy performance. "Mrs. Wilson, we do not typically accuse people based on speculation. This is data extracted from the GPS system in your luxury sedan." He opened the file, pointing to a map of movement crisscrossed with red lines, but all confined within the city limits. "This vehicle has never left the state boundaries of Connecticut in the past 30 days. No Cape Cod, no beach. You only drove from home to the Plaza Hotel 5 miles away and returned home once every 2 days for a very short period, just enough time to throw food into a cage for a pet." Elena's complexion began to change. The thick makeup could not hide the creeping anxiety. "And here," Sergeant Miller pulled out a stack of photos, "are the pictures you posted on Instagram of your happy holiday. Our technical team analyzed them. They are all Photoshop composites. You cut your daughter's face from old photos and pasted it onto beach scenes downloaded from the internet. Very sophisticated, but it still left pixel traces." Elena stepped back, hitting the wall. She stammered, You were spying on me." "That's not all." Sergeant Miller held up the final piece of evidence, an old pink smartwatch with a cracked screen. "We found this in Daisy's jacket pocket. The battery was dead long ago, but the automatic recording feature activated when it detected loud crying." He pressed the play button. A crackling sound emerged, then the quiet, desperate sobbing of a child in the dark night echoed clearly in the hushed room. "Wah, Daddy, I'm so hungry. It's so dark. Scratch, scratch, scratch." Sound of fingernails clawing at foam wall. The foam wall. It's like bread. I have to eat. Eat to wait for Daddy to come home. Stepmother Elena said if I scream, my mouth will be stitched shut. The recording ended with the child's painful, retching sounds. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. All of Elena's lies, all her layers of false morality completely collapsed before the raw, brutal truth. She had no escape. Elena's beautiful face twisted. Her eyes bulged red with rage and shame. She knew she had lost, but her arrogant nature would not allow her to bow down. "So what?" Elena shrieked, the sharp sound tearing through the air. She lunged toward Arthur, pointing a finger at his face with the aggression of an animal backed into a corner. "Yes, I locked her up. I locked up that burden. Do you think I enjoyed it? You travel all the time, throw money at me, and then expect me to babysit your unwanted child? I have my own life too." "Hugh!" Arthur was stunned, unable to believe his ears. She was a liability, a troublemaker, always sullen, always sneaking around like a ghost. I just wanted her out of my sight for a few days so I could breathe, so I could live like a human being who knew she was stupid enough to eat the foam wall. She brought it on herself. She deserved it. The malicious, cruel, and callous words poured out of the woman Arthur had loved, the woman he had trusted with his daughter. The entire room was silent. The ultimate selfishness of evil was revealed naked and repulsive, worse than any monster. Arthur saw the darkness in his wife's heart. He no longer felt anger. The rage had evaporated, replaced by a profound emptiness and utter contempt. This woman was not worthy of his anger. She was not worthy of being called a person. Arthur did not strike her or swear back. He simply looked at her with an icy gaze, as one might look at a pile of refuse. He slowly turned his back-faced Sergeant Miller and gave a small nod. "Take her away." Understanding the signal, the two officers immediately moved. They twisted Elena's arms behind her back with swift, decisive movements. "Let go. It hurts, Arthur. Help me. You can't do this to me." Clank, the sound of the handcuffs clicking shut on Elena's wrists. The sharp, cold clash of metal conclusively ended the perpetrator's arrogance and freedom. The two officers forcibly escorted Elena out of the room. She struggled, shrieked, cursed, then resorted to desperate pleading. Her screams echoed down the hospital hallway, drawing everyone's attention, but no one offered pity. The noise slowly faded, finally stopping after the elevator doors closed, taking the wicked woman to where she belonged, the cold confines of jail. Arthur stood alone in the empty office. The white light still illuminated the X-ray on the wall. Silence engulfed him, heavy and desolate. He had won. He had exposed the culprit, but why did his heart ache so much? He raised his hands to cover his face, his shoulders shaking with silent, lonely sobs between the four white walls. The evil one was apprehended, but will the scars on the child's body and soul ever heal? Was this victory for Arthur truly a triumph, or just the beginning of a prolonged regret? The hospital hallway was immersed in the quiet of the late night, broken only by the low hum of the air conditioning and the hurried footsteps of the night shift nurses. On the long bench across from the intensive care unit, Arthur sat like a statue carved from remorse and exhaustion. 1 week had passed since that dreadful night. A week he hadn't left this spot. Arthur's expensive suit was wrinkled and disheveled. A few buttons were undone, revealing his haggard appearance. Stubborn stubble covered his gaunt face, and his deep-set eyes were shadowed from lack of sleep. It was hard to recognize the celebrated millionaire architect, always appearing impeccably groomed and confidently poised. Now he was just an ordinary father, vulnerable and fearful of his daughter's fragile life. Through the dividing glass in the sterile white room, Daisy lay motionless on the hospital bed. The tangled tubes and bulky respirator had been mostly removed. Her abdomen had flattened, returning to its small shape, but leaving a long white bandage running down the surgical path, a permanent mark of the cruelty she endured. The ICU door gently opened. The nurse stepped out, offering Arthur a soft smile. "You can go in for a quick visit. She's sleeping, but her condition is much more stable now." Arthur quickly stood up, his numb legs causing him to stagger slightly. He nodded his thanks, then tiptoed into the room, holding his breath as if afraid to shatter the stillness inside. The smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils, but to Arthur now it was the scent of life, of hope. He pulled a chair close to the bedside, sitting down as softly as possible. Under the faint yellow nightlight, Daisy's face looked peaceful, yet terribly delicate. Her skin was still pale, her lips dry and cracked. Arthur reached out his rough hands, trembling as they gently touched his daughter's frail hand resting on the blanket. She was so small, completely lost within his palm. Arthur gazed at his daughter, his heart twisting repeatedly. In this silence, memories of the past flooded back like a slow-motion film, each frame a knife cutting into his heart. He remembered the long business trips, the endless all-night meetings. He remembered the times he returned home. Daisy ran to greet him, but he only gave her a perfunctory pat on the head before burying himself in his phone. He recalled the expensive gifts, limited edition dolls, princess dresses, the newest tablets. He sent them home regularly, smugly, thinking he was a thoughtful father, unaware that what Daisy needed most was not these inanimate objects. She needed a hug. She needed a dinner with her father sitting with her. She needed her father to listen to her trivial school stories. And he remembered her eyes that evening at dinner, the fearful, pleading gaze toward Elena, the desperate hunger in her eyes when she looked at the steak. Yet he had carelessly overlooked it. He chose to trust his wife's artificial smile rather than his paternal instinct. He let his child starve in his own gilded cage. I'm so sorry, sweetie." Arthur whispered, his voice choked and broken. His tears fell, soaking Daisy's tiny hand. He realized a bitter truth: the wealth, the reputation, the skyscrapers he had pursued for so long, all were meaningless. He had exchanged the childhood safety and happiness of his only child for these fleeting things. The price was too high, too cruel. Ring, ring, ring. His phone suddenly rang sharply, shattering the sacred silence. Arthur flinched quickly, pulling the phone from his jacket pocket to silence it. The screen lit up, showing his personal assistant's name, along with a flurry of urgent texts. "Boss, the Dubai project contract needs an immediate signature. The partner is waiting. The stock is volatile. Please answer." Arthur looked at the words, the numbers, the multi-billion-dollar projects, the work pressure that had once been his entire world. But now, looking at Daisy's small, fragile hand, they seemed so alien, so bothersome. Daisy subtly frowned in her sleep at the noise. Arthur held his breath, fearing she would wake. A new, unprecedented resolve rose within him. Arthur didn't answer the call. He pressed and held the power button. The screen went dark. He opened the back casing and removed the phone's SIM card, the SIM containing thousands of crucial business contacts. Without a moment's hesitation, Arthur stood up and walked toward the medical trash can in the corner of the room. He dropped the SIM card inside. Plink. A tiny sound, but it marked the end of the man he once was. Arthur returned to his seat, a strange sense of relief spreading through his chest. He saw the internal hospital phone on the bedside table. Arthur picked it up and dialed his private secretary. "Hello, Arthur. Thank goodness you called. Everyone is in a panic." "Listen, Sarah." Arthur interrupted, his voice deep, firm, and strangely calm. "I will not be returning to the company. Prepare the documents to transfer all operational authority to Vice President David. I resign." "Boss, what are you saying? Are you kidding? The Dubai project?" "I am not kidding. I am delegating everything to David. Handle it. From this moment on, I am no longer the CEO. I am only Daisy's father." Arthur hung up, not waiting for the reaction on the other end. Next, he called his personal lawyer. "Michael, it's Arthur. I want you to do one thing immediately. Sell the manor in Connecticut." "Sell the house?" "But that was your passion." "Arthur, you designed it yourself." "Sell it as quickly as possible. Sell all the furnishings with it. I don't want to keep anything. It's not a home. It's a cage, a place of the darkest memories. I want to erase every trace of it from my daughter's life." Arthur put the phone down. He let out a long breath, as if shedding the 1,000-pound weight that had rested on his shoulders for so many years. Power, status, fortune. He was ready to give it all up in exchange for time with his daughter to correct the mistakes he had made. Suddenly, the small hand in his moved slightly. Arthur started looking down. Daisy was slowly opening her eyes. Her large eyes, still showing fatigue from the surgery, blinked at the ceiling, then slowly shifted to look at him. In her gaze, there was still a trace of fear, the reflexive anxiety of a small bird that had weathered a storm. But upon recognizing her father's familiar face, the panic gradually dissolved, giving way to a creeping sense of security. "Dad." The call was weak as a breath, but to Arthur it was the most beautiful sound in the world. Arthur quickly leaned down, pressing her hand against his cheek, feeling the fragile warmth transferring to his rough skin. He didn't offer any more hollow apologies. An apology could not erase the scar on her abdomen, nor make up for the days of hunger in the dark. He simply allowed his hot tears to stream down, wetting her hand like a silent vow. Daisy watched her father's tears. She seemed to understand the pain and remorse in her father's heart. Her small, frail fingers gently moved, then slowly squeezed Arthur's thumb. A very gentle clasp, yet containing the boundless innocent forgiveness of a child. A faint, weak, but genuine smile bloomed on Daisy's dry lips. Outside the window, the heavy summer rain that had poured all night had completely ceased. The dark clouds vanished, revealing a clear, deep blue morning sky full of hope. The first rays of sunlight penetrated the leaves shining into the hospital room, signaling the start of a new day and a new life unfolding for the father and daughter. 6 months later. The gentle autumn breeze glided across the clear lake surface, creating small, sparkling ripples under the sunlight. Nestled amidst vast, stretching green lawns far away from the city's noise and dust, sat a charming, small wooden house. The house didn't have imposing marble columns or splendid crystal chandeliers, but it had large, transparent glass windows thrown wide open to welcome the sunlight and fresh air. Hanging baskets of vibrant petunias dangled brightly from the porch, swaying in the wind like soothing wind chimes. On the rustic wooden porch, Arthur sat on a low wicker chair. He wore a simple cotton t-shirt and beige chinos, having completely shed the image of the immaculate black-suited businessman of the past. In his hand, he held a wooden comb and a bunch of brightly colored hair ties. Sitting on a small wooden stool in front of him with her back to him was Daisy. Her hair had grown considerably dark and smooth, falling over shoulders that were now much healthier and plumper. Daisy sat still, her back straight, her feet gently swaying patiently, waiting for her special hairdresser to work his magic. Arthur awkwardly partitioned his daughter's hair. His large, rough, calloused hands that once signed multi-million-dollar contracts, that once sketched gravity-defying skyscrapers, were now clumsy and trembling before the soft strands of hair. He carefully combed each section, afraid of hurting her, his forehead beaded with sweat from the intense concentration, as if he were solving the hardest problem of his life. "Ouch, Dad, that tickles a little." Arthur flinched quickly, relaxing his grip. "I'm sorry, did I pull too hard? Let me try again." Daisy giggled, her clear, silvery laughter ringing out in the peaceful setting. She turned, squinting at her father playfully. "Don't be so stressed, Dad. My hair is strong. It won't fall out." His daughter's laughter was like a cool, refreshing breeze, sweeping away the last lingering dark clouds in Arthur's mind, dispelling the ghost of the painful past. He smiled, a bright, relieved smile that he hadn't worn in a very long time. "All right, sit still, young lady. Your dad is about to complete his masterpiece." After some fumbling, Arthur finally finished braiding 2 small, neat pigtails on either side of Daisy's head. Though the braids were slightly uneven, one higher than the other to Arthur, they were the most beautiful works of art he had ever created. He reached for a bright yellow wild daisy freshly picked from the garden and gently tucked it into her dark hair as an accent. "All done, my beautiful girl." Arthur gazed at his daughter, his eyes overflowing with love and pride. Daisy stood up, touched her hair, then spun around her floral dress, billowing out like a butterfly's wings. "Thank you, Dad, I love it," she cried out, then rushed down the steps and into the small garden patch in front of the house where the soil was freshly turned dark brown and moist. "Dad, hurry, come plant flowers with me." Arthur laughed heartily, stood up, dusted off his pants, and followed his daughter. The father and daughter crouched down beside the garden bed. Arthur handed Daisy a packet of sunflower seeds. "Now do you remember how I showed you dig a small hole just about as deep as your fingertip?" Daisy nodded vigorously. Her small hands stained with mud carefully placed each black seed into the earth. Arthur sat beside her, gently covering them with a thin layer of soil, then instructed her on how to water them so the ground was damp enough without washing the seeds away. "Dad." Daisy looked up, her large eyes fixed on her father. Will the flowers bloom before winter comes? Arthur stopped working and looked into her eyes. He saw the anticipation and a hint of innocent worry there. He placed his hand on her shoulder, his voice steady and warm. Absolutely, my darling. This flower is special. As long as it has sunlight and our loving care, it will rise up strong and bloom brilliantly, defying everything. Just like you. Arthur thought silently, but kept the words to himself. He watched Daisy intently watering the sleeping life in the soil. A silent vow swelled in the father's heart. He would be her sun. He would warm her, illuminate her path, and shield her from all the cold shadows. He would make up for all the dark days past with his full presence in every moment of her growth. Disclaimer: the above story is purely fictional. Names, places, and events have been constructed for the purpose of narrative illustration and educational messaging. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is entirely coincidental.